Could you briefly describe the history and importance of study in the Dominican tradition? Um, for me, I think the importance is ultimately about knowing Jesus Christ. And I think that was what inspired Dominic to consider study as an important component. People really didn't know a lot in his day about Jesus, and he wanted well-educated friars to be able to explain to them in a way that made sense to them the faith and the life that they were called to.
Yeah, and I might just extend that a little by saying there's a lot of ways you can know Christ, and so Christ was known in liturgy and in sort of living his things, but Dominic said, but it doesn't matter what you think about Christ too, what we actually believe about him, the ideas associated with Jesus. And so that's why I study rather than simply, living the faith. And it was lacking. It was really thin in Dominic's day.
I would come at it in a different angle. I think study was birthed in our order by engagement with people. Especially Dominic makes the strategic decision to disperse his little band of friars to the universities. And that's when engagement begins. He starts, the young friars go to Paris, to Oxford, and Padua and Bologna and all these centers of studies, and they're being exposed to different ideas, and some radically different ideas from the gospel. And because there's something going on in Europe in that period of history. The cities are being founded, what today we would call the profit economy was emerging, and so there were all kinds of questions that had never been asked before, and he wanted them to immerse themselves in those issues and study those issues so that the gospel would come to a clarity and, in a sense, engage their intellect, so it was a reasonable thing to follow Christ. It wasn't something quaint of another age, but it was relevant and not only relevant to them, but contributing to what was happening in society. So this engagement was mutual, and we see this later in kind of, if you will, almost the person who becomes the great architect of our city, Aquinas. Like Aquinas always begins his thinking with hearing the objection to what he's going to say. And sometimes, if you read his works, his replies to his objections are more insightful than his positions, which sometimes can be ponderous, even though he wrote this for beginning students. But I never was able to give that book to my beginning students. They always found it a bit more advanced, but they were different students at that time, not like what we have at the University of Wisconsin today. So they could just engage themselves. That's a little dig there. So that's the way I would see it. I would see study coming from engagement and then moving in. And then, of course, theological education, scripture study has to be expanded to respond to these ongoing things. And we've seen this over and over and over and over again through our history. When the Americas are discovered by the Europeans, it's the Dominicans at Salamanca in Spain that are engaged with the friars in America. Even things today we might feel are weird, but were the Native Americans human beings? Those kind of questions. And so people like Francisco Varieties developed a system of international law, which still influences international law today. So that's one way of looking at it anyway. So.
And I'm going to also say, even before we went to the universities, in Dominic's fundamental vision for leaving the cathedral was there's this heresy of the Albigensians who think the body is bad, and they have a very developed philosophy and a particular interpretation of scripture and many other things that the local clergy and bishops were unable to refute because they weren't educated. They weren't philosophically sophisticated enough. They didn't know the tradition enough. And so just that fundamental vision of we need to know enough not to combat them, but to debate them and let the truth win out.
And convince them of the truth.
Yeah. So, I mean, fundamental to what Dominic was all about from the beginning.
So we tend to be men with many letters behind our name.
Yeah.
That is